You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt show Joe Carlen, who's the author of a biography of Benjamin Graham called The Einstein of Money. And he's also a business consultant. Joe, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me on.
So you wrote another book about Ben Graham, and not that I'm complaining because it's a great book, but why another one?
Well, there's really only one other biography of him that was written, and that was written in 1994, which was before his memoirs were released. And he passed away in 1976, and his memoirs were not released until 1996. And it's a very rich resource, not only about his personal life and so forth, but about his some of his investment ideas. So I thought it was an opportune time to write a biography that had access to his memoirs.
Okay, and why did you choose to title it The Einstein of Money?
Well, because, for one, there are not many people there's trillions of dollars that are allocated, at least partially according to his principles, and not just Berkshire Hathaway, but everything from Berkshire Hathaway to Japanese equity funds and funds all over the world that are using Graham's principles to one extent or another. So that's one, and two, the fact that and that speaks to the second principle, which is that here you have someone who wrote about investing. The two classics were written in 1934 and 1949, and they're still being those principles are still being applied with some just minor modifications. And there's no other investment writer, I think, that who stood the test of time to the same extent. So that's another. And lastly, he's not just an investment guru. He also has some really fascinating ideas about currency reform, about reforming money itself. So for those reasons, I think he revolutionized investment finance, and according to some, his biggest contributions were actually in macroeconomics.
Mm-hmm. In fact, Benjamin Graham is not his original name, his birth name, right?
Yeah, his original name was Benjamin Grossbaum, and his mother changed the name in World War I, and ostensibly it's because of anti-German sentiment, because Grossbaum is a Germanic name. Its root is Germanic, but it's likely that it was changed because it was a Jewish name.
I see. And in fact, they were a pretty religious family growing up?
Yes. I think his father's family was more religious, because in his family he talks about having French tutors, and whereas in his father's family that was not allowed. And so I think it was somewhat. Certainly. I think his family in Britain were more religious, but he was raised, I'd say, in a somewhat religious family. But I get the sense that after his father passed away when he was only 9. After that, I think they became somewhat less observant.
All right. So let's go back to what you were pointing out before. In fact, it's sort of amazing that he was able to write about macroeconomic issues decades and decades ago, and a lot of that still applies today. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think he had an unusually broad and deep intellect, and part of that was, I think, just who he was, and part of it was he read so extensively. Since he was a child, he just read about everything in multiple languages, and I think that gave him a perspective. Charles Brandis, one of his disciples, says that he believes that Graham's knowledge of history gave him the perspective of eternity, which is very important when investing. And so he had this very broad historical perspective, and he saw that the market was really a reflection of human behavior. So that's why it follows these patterns. You can't always time the patterns, but you can tell when people are overreacting, with excessive greed, or on the other hand, excessive fear. And then he devised ways of taking advantage of that.
Mm-hmm. It's funny you mentioned Charles Brandis, who runs a money management firm. My day job is that I'm an investment advisor. I only get to do these radio interviews once a week. And one of the money managers we work with, in fact, is Brandis. And specifically, it's because they have really focused on a lot of the philosophy of Ben Graham.
Yeah, and I was fortunate to interview Mr. Brandis for the book, and he still has evident warmth when he recalls Graham, and Graham tutored him personally, as I'm sure you know. So it's a very interesting person to talk to about Graham.
Mm-hmm. We are talking with Joe Carlen, who wrote a recently released book about a biography of Benjamin Graham, who's considered one of the founders and sort of one of the greatest thinkers of the economy today, and has had a strong effect on people like Warren Buffett, who has done rather well for himself following the Graham methodology. Joe, let me ask you a question. Warren Buffett's a brilliant guy, and I don't think anyone would doubt that. Is the work that Graham did something that regular investors can use on their own, or is it really only meant for other brilliant Wall Street types? Well,
Graham's second investment classic, The Intelligent Investor, was written specifically for the lay investor, what Buffett describes as the dentist in Pocatello, Idaho, or the lawyer in Austin, Texas. So sort of the professional who has some disposable income, but who doesn't have all the time in the world to invest. So that book is written specifically for that kind of investor, and actually even within that book, there's two different levels. There's what he calls a defensive investor or the enterprising investor, and the defensive is one with less time and less risk tolerance. So in that respect, some of his prescriptions are specifically for the lay investor, whereas some of his other works, most notably Security Analysis, is definitely geared towards the more kind of avid investment finance. That was actually written for taken from his class, the same class that actually Buffett took in 1950, I believe. So really, it's for both in a sense, because the essential principles are not particularly complicated, but there's different ways of applying them, and also depends on how much of a purist you want to be in applying them. I mean, Buffett himself is not 100% purist in terms of his application of Graham's methods.
Mm-hmm. Did you meet any investors who really follow it to the T?
That's an interesting question. I think there are different degrees, and I think of the investors that I interviewed, and I was fortunate to be able to interview Warren Buffett and Brandis and Irving Kahn. I think Irving Kahn, for example, is someone who's probably the Kahn brothers. They describe themselves as sort of doing a modified Graham-Dodd approach, but it seems like some of their emphasis and some of they do some of smaller cap work that's probably a little bit more in line with what Graham did. Whereas, as I asked Buffett about how his approach differs, and he says because he's managing such large sums, he can't always find these relatively small margins, which is what Graham did. So he has to sometimes make investments where it's what they call buying a great company at a reasonable price, as opposed to some of what Graham did was to buy companies at great prices, right? Whether they're good companies or not so good companies, but just buy them so discounted that you're just guaranteed to make money sooner or later. So Yeah, I think there's different levels. I think Tom Russo maybe was very interesting. He applies Graham's methods to the developing world in really interesting ways, and he focuses a lot on the balance sheet and heavy discounting. So, yeah, I think there's different. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think there's anyone I met who really who necessarily is 100%.
How about Graham himself? Was he a super wealthy guy because he followed his own methods?
You know, yes and no. He, on the one hand, in I think 1928, he made the equivalent of what's $7 million today. He made about $600,000 in personal income, which is an enormous sum. Yet it's difficult to say because he gave much of his money away, and but we know that from just his stake in Geico alone, he made over 200 times what the investment was.
Wow.
And there's stories of his grandson paying medical school just from a piece of that Geico investment. So it's really hard to track exactly. But all indications are that he made all the money he wanted to make, and after a certain point, he just put his money into municipal bonds and just didn't want to track the market anymore. And he still got back into it later, just sort of on an intellectual level, writing about it. But he was not as Buffett said, he wasn't thinking about money all the time as Buffett does. I mean, and that's what Buffett told me, as Buffett does, and as other people Buffett knows do. And it was just one of his interests. So he just looked at it. He wanted to attain a certain level of financial security, and once he did, he was happy to kind of, sort of put his money in municipal bonds and just sort of focus his time on other things. Mm-hmm. So in a way, he set the intellectual framework for others to use as they choose.
Got it. Okay. We have been talking to Joe Carlen, who wrote a book that just came out about Benjamin Graham called The Einstein of Money. He's been explaining to us some of Graham's ideas. In fact, Joe, on this side, you're not just an author, but you are a business consultant as well, yeah?
That's correct. Focus mainly on market assessments and some valuation work as well.
All right. So in the last few seconds, just tell me, how can people follow you and your work?
So they can go to knowthymarket.com.
Clever website.
Thank you. KNOWTHY Market. And for more about the book, you can go to EinsteinofMoney.com.
Okay, Joe Carlen, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.